Pharaoh's Chariots and the real Red Sea of the Exodus. For most of the faithful of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the story of the Exodus from Egypt has been a fact which has not been questioned. This event is part of biblical history. It is written in the Torah of Judaism and also alluded to in the Quran of the Muslim faith. But even before the artifacts we will be discussing and showing in this study were discovered, there was little reason to doubt that these events were true, except to those of more modern times, as the secular movement has grown and become a growing force of non-believers who deny almost every truth written in these historical and holy manuscripts. The discoveries we are about to show were stumbled upon quite by accident in the 1970s, some in the 1980s, and others during the Gulf War. With regards to the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein had roughly 1,500 heavy tanks positioned on the border between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And in order to conceal them, he buried them in sand, leaving only the gun turrets sticking out. These were well camouflaged and effectively made them invisible from the air or from ground surveillance units. But they were discovered. America shifted its spy satellite into position over the Iraqi desert, and the American spy satellite, which was equipped with infrared scanners, took pictures of the cold desert floor during the twilight hours from 155 miles above the Earth. This satellite with its infrared detectors could detect a temperature difference of only a degree or so. Now the satellite was placed in position to take pictures of the buried tanks because the tanks would heat up during the daylight hours, and because they were mostly metal, they would hold on to the heat long after the sun had gone down and the rest of the desert began to cool during the night. To the spy satellite, the buried tanks showed up as bright shapes in the dark. So the exact location of each tank was then plotted, targeted on a map, and then given to Allied jets, which then eliminated them. But quite by accident, the satellite also discovered other things that astonished the military and startled skeptics of the Bible and the other holy writings. The satellite found evidence to support the story of Moses, who led the exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt, and the drowning of Pharaoh's pursuing army of charioteers across the Red Sea. This biblical event is often attacked by critics who don't believe in God or Christ or any of the characters of the Bible other than that they were historical characters or historical figures at best. But before the Iraq War, while divers were searching for possible remains of this event in the Gulf of Suez, certain professors scoffed at the whole idea of the Bible story. They said it could not be the truth. Some said emphatically that the biblical Exodus and the parting of the Red Sea and the drowning of Pharaoh's army never really happened. Yet the American spy satellite discovered evidence that these people had been looking in the wrong place, in other words, in the Gulf of Suez. And when they began to look at the other Gulf, which is the Gulf of Aqaba, indeed, there was a trail leading to and from the Gulf. And when divers went to the Gulf of Aqaba, they found human skeletal remains, the skeletal remains of horses, the remains of chariots and chariot wheels, chariot cabs, all mixed together and scattered over the seabed of the Gulf of Aqaba, from Egypt all the way to Saudi Arabia. Here they found a huge debris field of remains in which there were 6-spoke wheels, 4-spoke wheels, and 8-spoke wheels of chariots, as well as human remains and the remains of horses. And some of these had been discovered in the 1970s by biblical archaeologist and diver Ron Wyatt and his team, and by another team during the 80s. But these artifacts were dismissed because they were thought to be in the wrong place, since many assumed that the Red Sea was the Gulf of Suez. The unconvincible skeptics said this is the wrong location for these artifacts. But even after these artifacts were discovered and documented, the skeptics claimed that they were not what they appeared to be. The location did throw a lot of people because, again, most assumed that the Red Sea was the Gulf of Suez. But according to the biblical account, the Red Sea parted and the Hebrews escaped on dry land to the opposite coast. But when Pharaoh's army pursued, the sea rolled back from both sides and drowned them all. Again, the skeptics came out and said the Gulf of Aqaba is not the Red Sea. So this find is in the wrong place. But if you look at a map of this area or a satellite photo, you will see that the Red Sea separates Africa from Arabia, then splits into two fingers: the Gulf of Suez in Egypt and the Gulf of Aqaba between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Some have assumed that if the event occurred at all, it would have had to have happened in the Gulf of Suez, closest to Egypt. However, that is not so. If you take the geographical details given in the Bible report literally, they will actually not lead you to the Gulf of Suez, but to the Gulf of Aqaba, to a spot on the coast near Nuweiba. This is the exact place where the remains were found beneath the waves of the Gulf of Aqaba, all the way across to the other side on Saudi Arabia. If we look up the word red, as in Red Sea, from nearly any place it appears in the Bible, in the Strong's Concordance, it says that this word red means reeds or rushes, water plants of Red Sea, sea of rushes, arms of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Suez, and of the sea from the straits of the Gulf of Aqaba. The Gulf of Aqaba being bordered on the north by the land of the Edomites, or Edom, which means red and is probably where the name of this sea was derived. Now the Egyptians had war chariots in their army, and these, together with all the other Egyptian chariots, were used by the Egyptian army when they pursued after the children of Israel, as it is written in Exodus chapter 14, verses 6 and 7. And he made ready his chariot, and he took his people with him, and he took 600 chosen chariots, and all of them chariots of Egypt, and captains over every one of them. These Egyptian war chariots were intended for quick battles. They often had two soldiers, one who drove the chariot and one who fought from the chariot with bow or arrow or sword. These chariots were relatively light. The bodywork was a basket or was made of wood or leather, in some cases even gold. And the flooring was made of wood, and the wheel axle fastened on the other underneath side to the floor. And then a wooden shaft leading to the horses. This was also attached to the underside of the floor of the chariot. So then now let's go and take a look at some of these artifacts which were found on the bottom of the Sea of Aqaba, or the Gulf of Aqaba, which is the actual Red Sea. We will see chariot wheels, human remains, and horse bones which were found on the floor of the Gulf of Aqaba. We see here a human rib cage and other bones from this underwater site. Even the vertebrae are visible, and when enhanced are more clear. And here is a femur, also found near the rest of these artifacts, again on the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba. And here are other human leg bones which were recovered from the site. Here is a horse hoof excuse me, found at the site and recovered and brought back on shore. Here is a set of wheels to a chariot, still attached to their axle, standing on their side, heavily encrusted with coral and other sediments. And here is the same image superimposed so that you can see exactly what this is. Here is an actual wheel that is almost barely discernible until it is enhanced a bit. But even so, you can easily see the shape of the ring and of the spokes. Here is an axle sticking up with the wheel ring missing, but with the spokes still protruding. Here again is a superimposed image to show you exactly what you are looking at. Now, here is a wheel sticking up out of the mud, which has part of the axle left sticking up. This particular one was found on the Arabian side of the Gulf of Aqaba. And here is an actual chariot body, still almost whole, laying on its side, with its connecting shaft still intact. It has also been enhanced to show you how it ended up laying on its side. The white lines simply denote the shape of the chariot. And here we see some of the wheels laying on the bottom of the Gulf. We see a 4-wheel spoke, 6-wheel spokes, and 8-wheel spoke designs. And here are some of the depictions from actual tombs or actual drawings on walls in Egypt, showing how these chariot wheels lying on the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba match up perfectly with Egypt's chariots. Here is an actual chariot cab found in the Red Sea. Now, here is one that is a 4-spoke wheel model, which looks like it could be a more modern wheel. Either that, or it was made of a heavy metal such as gold or some other metal, which was probably covered over by mud and has creeped back above the sediments. To me, this wheel looks more modern, but it's interesting that the skull laying on top of this wheel has been identified as being that of a horse. If this is indeed a chariot wheel, there's little reason to believe that it is not, considering its location with the rest of all these artifacts, and its depth in 200 feet of water. Then it is very well preserved for its age, and would be made from a material like gold or some other metal which the Egyptians had the ability to smelt, which was probably buried and protected from the coral or other forms of life on the ocean floor. This chariot with its four-wheel spokes made of this metal would have probably belonged to part of the Egyptian aristocracy. Now let's go and look at a real chariot from Tutankhamun's tomb. Now this is either a very good replica or the actual chariot found by Professor Howard Carter in the 1920s. Howard Carter being the discoverer of King Tutankhamun's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Now, could these wheels, these chariot remains found on the seabed, be from some other event than Exodus? Well, they could, but probably not. Because if we look at these wheels and ask the question, what do these wheels tell us about the dates and about the events which caused them to end up here on the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba, the number of spokes help us to arrive at a fairly precise answer. When pictures taken by divers were shown to Egyptologists and archaeologists, they immediately identified them as being from the 18th dynasty, or thereabouts. The four-spoke wheels were used in the early period of the 18th dynasty until the time of King Thutmose IV. The eight-spoked wheels can still be seen on the chariot and bodies of Thutmose IV war chariots, but were considered to be a short-lived experiment. According to some, the reign of Thutmose IV was the only time in history, or Egyptian history that is to say, that eight-spoke wheels were ever used. But others put the date back before that time, even to Thutmose III, which is more likely. After Thutmose IV, mostly only six-spoke wheels were used on Egyptian chariots. However, this establishes a ballpark date for the wheels discovered on the seabed of the Gulf of Aqaba. The reign of Thutmose III and the reign of Thutmose IV. Now Thutmose III lived in the time of the biblical timeline chronology of Exodus. So it's very likely that Thutmose was the king, or the Pharaoh, of the land of Egypt during this time. According to some biblical archaeologists and biblical chronologies or timelines, the Exodus took place around the year 1446 BC, which would be the reign of Thutmose III, and would make sense because Moses was adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh and would probably be named after the family, therefore Moses of Thutmose II. Also found were two pillars, two granite pillars of Phoenician Israelite design, which were dated to be 3,000 years old, which many claim were put there by King Solomon to commemorate the crossing of the Red Sea. One pillar was on the west side of the Gulf of Aqaba, the other on the east side in Saudi Arabia. On the Saudi Arabian side pillar were found the words Moses, Pharaoh, Mitzrayim, which is Egypt, Yahweh, which is God's name, and the word Edom. Again, the land of Edom, of course, on the northern border of this body of water, and probably where the Red Sea gets its name. The pillar on the Saudi Arabian side has since been defaced and all of these names removed because of the hatred for Israel amongst modern Muslims. But back to the satellite photography. In searching for the military hardware in the Gulf War, the satellite showed up something interesting in Egypt. It showed a great desert road written of in Exodus. A discovery that shocked even hardened skeptics. As I noted, critics had said for years that the events of Exodus had never happened and were not real. Yet, Israel did become a people and a nation, and are still a people. They did come to the land of Canaan, and crossed over the river Jordan, and settled that land, and formed Jerusalem, and formed Samaria. Jerusalem, which still exists to this day. But also the satellite imagery, to everyone's amazement, showed up a thin red line. Heated areas show up as thin red lines or red lines to infrared scanners. Now, I don't have those photos. They're probably still classified. But here is a photo taken from satellite of the Great Desert Road, which I was able to find. But on the infrared photos, according to military experts who viewed them, was seen running eastward from the Nile Delta, in other words, the land of Goshen, referred to in the biblical book of Exodus, a road running eastward skirting the east side of the Red Sea. The book of Exodus states that the escaping Hebrew slaves in Egypt traveled around the desert road toward the Red Sea in Exodus chapter 13:8. The satellite photo team examined this red line with interest from the Nile Delta, and they noticed that the line went first eastward towards Succoth. Now, according to the book of Exodus, it was at Succoth that the Israelites, as they had left Egypt, were organized into ranks for the journey. The line extended over the high plateau of the traditional Sinai Peninsula, finally dropping down to what is today called the Gulf of Aqaba, at its easternmost finger of the Red Sea. Again, Nueba. Now, was this the route of the true Exodus? Well, it makes more sense than the Gulf of Suez. If you look at a map of this area, it would appear that, if this is true, the Hebrews were trapped with the Gulf of Aqaba in front of them and the foreboding mountains behind them, through which the pursuing army of Pharaoh came after them. As it is written in Exodus chapter 14, beginning with verse 19, "And the angel of God, which went before the camp of Israel, removed and went behind them. And the pillar of the cloud went from before their face and stood behind them." In other words, between Israel and the oncoming Egyptians. Verse 20. And it came to pass and it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. And it was a cloud of darkness to them, but it gave light by night to these, so that the one came not near to the other all night. In other words, they were protected all night long. Verse 21. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. Verse 22. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon dry ground, and the waters were a wall thereof upon them on the right hand and on their left. Verse 23. And the Egyptians pursued and went in after them into the midst of the sea, even all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Verse 24. And it came to pass that in that morning watch, the Lord looked upon the host of the Egyptians through the pillars of fire and of the cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians. Verse 25. And took off their chariot wheels, that they drave them heavily. In other words, slowed them down. So the Egyptians said, Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fighteth for them against the Egyptians. Verse 26. And the Lord said unto Moses, Stretch out thine hand over the sea, that the waters may come again upon the Egyptians, and their chariots, and upon their horsemen. Verse 27. And Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to his strength. And when the morning appeared, and the Egyptians were fled against it, the Lord overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Verse 28. And the waters returned and covered the chariots, and the horsemen, and all the host of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. And there remained not so much as one of them. In other words, they were all destroyed. Verse 29. But the children of Israel walked on dry land, upon dry land, in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall unto them on the right hand and on their left. Verse 30. Thus the Lord saved Israel out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw that the Egyptians were dead upon the seashore. In other words, some of them washed up on the shore. Verse 31. And Israel saw the great work which the Lord did upon the Egyptians, and the people feared, or better, revered the Lord, and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. And the evidence found at the Gulf of Aqaba, at Nuweiba, and across to Saudi Arabia suggests that this account is true and accurate. Now, the red line seen by the spy satellite came down to the sea of the Gulf of Aqaba and then continued into what is present-day Saudi Arabia at the foot of a high peak known as Jebel el-Lawz, which is most likely the real Mount Sinai. The satellite team looked at the photo, and a red line that traced the route as if it were drawn by God's own hand, and traced the exact route of the Hebrew Exodus. The red line entered the sea at Nueva on the east side and came out of the Gulf of Aqaba and emerged again on the west side of the Gulf in Saudi Arabia. And the sea area between these two red lines is precisely where the dive teams discovered the Egyptian chariots, the wheels, and the skeletal remains. When the Gulf War finally ended, archaeologists went back to the region to discover how it was possible for a 3,500-year-old trail to exist well enough to show up on a satellite photo. They found that a large, vast number of people, no doubt with much livestock, pulverized and disrupted the sand. Then during the desert nights, the humidity rose, thus wetting the powdery sand, making it hardened like unto a concrete-like substance. And through the years, the highway was buried by shifting sands, thus protecting the trail from the elements. However, during the day, just below the surface, it would heat up, much like the Iraqi tanks, being that it was more dense than the surrounding sand, and continue holding the heat longer into the cold nights, thus showing up brightly for the satellite. Now, is this all a coincidence? Very doubtful. An interesting 3,500-year-old prophecy in Exodus chapter 9:16 states, "But indeed for this purpose I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name be declared in all the earth." This event was so spectacular, unlike any other in history, that it has been the subject of many famous depictions or paintings, or Hollywood epics such as the Ten Commandments. And this historical event of 3,500 years ago or so has indeed been declared in all the earth. Now, this story should be an example to all Christians that God protects His own, and that Pharaoh here was a type of Satan, who is always in pursuit of the faithful, and his army with him. Yet God will destroy them in the end, and God's faithful shall be set free. Only now it is the truth which sets us free. You can see more about this incredible find right here on YouTube in a video called "Revealing God's Treasure, the Red Sea Crossing." So, are these Pharaoh's chariots or something else? Well, you will have to decide that. But it is a foregone conclusion that disbelievers and naysayers will automatically say, no, 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 these are not Pharaoh's chariots, and these artifacts must have some logical explanation other than the biblical story for how they came to be at the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba. But then again, if Moses himself were to transfigure right before them, as he did with Elijah, accompanying Jesus on the Mount of Olives, and he was to tell these disbelievers that yes, these were indeed the chariots of Pharaoh that followed the children of Israel during the Exodus, they still wouldn't believe. Anyway, this evidence is presented for you to make up your own mind. And may our Father reveal the truth to you on this matter, and to all who diligently seek His counsel and wisdom in His Word. And may He reveal much more to you, for there are many more truths in the Bible than people know. Thank you for listening and watching this presentation. This has been Just Thoughts.